happy to see so many smiling faces. My name's Marilyn Marler. I'm the new-ish executive director here at the Montana Natural History Center, where our goal is backgrounds with nature through a variety of different kinds of programming. I wanted to encourage you to be a member of us if you're not already a member. I know many of you are. And I wanted to pitch an upcoming class. Raise your hand if you've ever heard field notes on the KUFM MTPR. Yeah, so those come from here at the Montana Natural History Center, and you could write one. And we have a writing workshop led by Allison DeYoung, and you could sign up for it. It's a 6-week class, and you could write one of those yourself and read it on the radio. So that's not why we're here today. Today what we basically have is an awesome book written by three guys who met each other back in the 1900s, and look at them now. They've turned out pretty strong, 1 century strong and going well. Bruce Bugbee, I have known Bruce for a long time, since I moved to Missoula in the early 90s, and he was a big deal before my time in Montana, and I appreciate him sharing his time with us. He's a land conservation consultant, and he founded American Public Land Exchange, and I think if you are following conservation issues in western Montana, you probably know Bruce, and probably you have met his co-authors, Bob. No, oh, I'm sorry. I said Bob, but I was thinking Jack. Now I'm torn. Well, who should I talk first? Jack is, we just got to know each other a little bit tonight, and Jack is lovely. I learned that he's a professor emeritus of geography at New Mexico State University and spends his time between the Rattlesnake and New Mexico State. He's done over 100 conservation easements. Whew. 1 per year? No, I'm just kidding. Oh, no. Trying to set the tone for conversation. And Bob Kiesling is the former executive director of both the Montana Environmental Information Center, who I'm very familiar with, and the Big Sky Office of the Nature Conservancy. So thank you all for your work, and thank you for coming to share your beautiful book with us. And
could I add one thing here?
yes.
Before this slide leaves the screen here, notice at the bottom tier here, maps by Kevin McManigal and Hannah Schaefer. Hannah, yes.
I have one more thing. And I forgot to thank, on mic, I want to thank MCAT for being here to record this for posterity. We're really excited to be partnering with MCAT. This is the second this month that they've done for us. So let's give them a round of applause. All right, I'm going to just hand it over to you guys.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. Let me get out of that glare. Bruce, Bob, and I met here at the University of Montana in 1973, I think. I come from Maine originally, but Montana's been essentially my home since '73. Got that job at New Mexico State, which was really good, but the three of us cut our teeth together in land conservation and trying to invent something to do to put our hands on good work to help conserve, literally, the good earth. And we found our way, and here we are 50 plus years later, still friends, even after 5 years of this project. Oh my God. And Bob Kiesling, we call him Kies. We should definitely mention that the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes trusted us enough to contribute their own chapter and made their own map of their work, which is astonishing. And we'll touch on that tonight. Notice also that Shane Doyle, he's of the Crow tribe. He wrote a chapter on the general idea of stewardship being an indigenous thing. As Robin Wall Kimmerer said, if you're white, you can't be indigenous, but you can become naturalized, right? You can feel that deep sense of belonging in a place, and we do. Steve Running, also from Missoula, was part of the Nobel Prize winning climate change team. And Todd Wilkinson, a very well-respected journalist, has focused a lot on the greater Yellowstone, but topics of all kinds. Amazing set of people. We're humbled to be the ones who tell the tale. Others could have done it, but we stepped up. We've been involved 50 plus years. We've talked about Hannah. If you ever need any maps made, my God, Hannah Schaefer. I'm not bluffing here. You'll see the maps and your eyes will bug out. So I have a PhD in geography, which means I know all the state capitals. Anyway, and Kevin League, a photographer in Helena, who also used to work for the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department doing conservation. All of his photos are in here. Oregon State University Press, bless them, decided to publish the book. And if it were not for the Foundation for Montana History, who became our fiscal home, I'm not sure where we'd be. Because this project took about $120,000 for cartography, the photographer, design expenses, you name it. This has been a very expensive project for the greater good. So, we have a clicker. So the origins of this, about 5 years ago, we're getting old, and the joke is we're so old, if there was a dating site, it would be called carbon dating. Sorry, that's a groaner. I apologize for that. Suddenly it's not clicking. Oh my God. Help. I turned it off. Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. I came here early just to make sure that would work.
This is actually a good break because I can turn off the bird song that's in the background.
I wondered if I was hearing things. Yeah, and the lights, that would be nice. Because these images, you need to really be able to see these. It tells more than half of the story that we're going to share tonight. I'm stalling. There we go. Nope. The lights, now, action. I was here at 5:15. I apologize. I must have pushed the wrong button. It's working. Yay. Okay, and that light over there, if you could get that too, some of these others. Let's give these photos their prominence. And that one over there is kind of bright. This is one of Kevin League's many beautiful photos. Thank you. Where is this, Bob? Up on the Rocky Mountain front, and Bob will share the tale a little bit of that region. We love this place with a deep and abiding emotion. We have two brains, right? The left and right hemisphere. Robin Wall Kimmerer talked about two-eyed seeing. We have the rational evidence, argument-based side. We have the aesthetic, emotional. Let's call it what it is. This book is a love story. We love Montana, and we want to give back to this place for everything that has given us. That's hard to even express. Words and worlds, that's where the literature comes in, that we'll talk about tonight. But let's also remember that this was a place, pardon? We're good? Okay. Closer? Okay, yes ma'am. Is that better? Okay. This is Montana before people, because you can see the glacial lobes. The light isn't the best, but we have large ice cap in Yellowstone. We have the continental ice, all these proglacial lakes, like Glacial Lake Missoula, a vast body of water. We know the story here in this valley. And all the ecosystems that we know today, they form by migration after the ice melt, after things began to warm up. Things are warming up now, but a few degrees in 1,000 years is different than a few degrees in 100 years. And so the pace of change now is dramatic. All the ecosystems we think of today were not necessarily here. Even the ponderosa pine, which is our dearest friend for many of us, didn't arrive into eastern Montana until 1,200 years ago. There were no pea pines out there. We know this because of fossil pollen grains. Kathy Whitlock at Montana State University is an expert at paleoecology. You find a lake, you dig up the mud, you find the pollen grains, you figure out the species, radiocarbon, date the layer, and you know what was growing around it. It's an amazing tale of change. And into this, of course, comes Native people. Shane Doyle, one of our authors, these are the homelands with the smaller areas in brown showing the current reservations. Now, Shane Doyle, there were skeletons found on the Shields River, which is at the base of the Crazy Mountains, many years ago. They dug them up. There were 2 kids, maybe 8, 10 years old, buried with equivalent of toys and amulets, lovingly buried. They dated the bones to 12,000 years ago. And they said, well, why don't we check the DNA in the bone marrow and look at Native people across Montana? Shane Doyle is related to those kids. 12,000 years. And that's just the beginning of our understanding of the antiquity of Indigenous people here. Yes? Okay. How's the volume now? Is it working for everybody? If I hold this up well? Good, my pleasure. So, when we think about that, the Native people, their stewardship or taking care of the earth was so good that when white people finally arrived, Europeans arrived, the ecosystems were pretty intact, pretty good shape. And if Native people were lousy at land carrying, land stewardship, it would not have been the case. The larger issue of Ice Age megafauna is a global story. But in terms of what the grizz and the elk and the wolves, all these incredible species, they're here. So stewardship, Robert Frost said, we belong to the land before the land belonged to us. Well, belong's a funky word in that sense, isn't it? Because we feel like we belong to the land. We care for the land, and that's where stewardship comes in. Caring for the place based on ethics and ecology. It's worth remembering that oikos is the root word in Greek for both economics and ecology. The house. Measuring the house, studying the house. So reciprocity, a big word in this story. We want to give back. What do you do when you have so much in your heart about this place, you don't know what to do? Well, you find a way to help, to conserve. And across Montana, as you'll see, people have. This is where literature comes in. They give us the vocabulary we may not have had before, but we feel it in our hearts. That place where your kid took their first step, or that fishing hole you prized, like much more up on the Blackfoot. You might have hunted that drainage if that was your first hunt. You proposed to your sweetheart up that canyon. And Bruce, the story of the rattlesnake protection has an element of a proposal in it. Remember Joe and his wife? So when we think about stewardship in Montana, there's a divide between the public land and the private lands. We think mostly of the public, the wilderness areas, Glacier, Yellowstone, wildlife management areas, and so forth. The Bureau of Land Management, federal laws, that's public involvement, advocacy. Private lands are very different because in our Constitution, there is a protection of private property rights. You can't regulate someone to the point where you're taking their land, substantially taking most of the value of what they have. That is unconstitutional. It's not neighborly, and it doesn't work. So regulatory land use planning decides how the land will be developed, not whether it should be. And I say this as a recovering planner. Sorry, that was supposed to be a joke. I was, believe it or not, the county planner over in Granite County for a while in the 70s, and then Mineral County for almost 5 years. And well, you weren't a popular figure, let's put it that way. All you were doing is making sure the septic tanks worked and the roads are built to specs. There was not much else to consider. Pardon me. So when we look at a Montana landscape like this in the Big Hole, we see the high country is often in official protection, public land. The middle ground is, say, generic Forest Service land where there's forest plans and involvement. But then the whole valley bottom is private. And we know, of course, that it's not sufficient to just have high country, or else we would not have this idea of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. 2.2 million acre national park is not enough. Because what does Glacier or Yellowstone do? In the summer, it breathes in elk and other wildlife species up to the summits, up to the plateau, and then in the winter when it gets cold, it breathes them out. And where do they go? They go to valley bottoms. And if that is developed, wildlife species are degraded. And this is the issue we're talking about. People need a place to live. We're not no-growth people. But this fragmentation and subdivision of these valleys is the issue we felt was most pressing in terms of land conservation. So in our book, we acknowledge subdivision is happening, but what works on private property? Regulations aren't up to this. They're not designed for that job. And how can we think about landscape ecology principles with whatever we do, right? A bigger area is better than small, and you can read them. These are sort of common sense, aren't they? Connections are vital, so is water. So this is a general, what we call land ownership, land tenure map of Montana. Everything in white is private land. Everything other colors are different versions. Of course, you have Indian reservations, but you also have the Bob, Glacier, Yellowstone, Selway Bitterroot, Pintlers, but a whole lot of private land. What do you do there? Well, the tool that works there, you may have heard of, it's called a conservation easement. Big subject, simply put, is instead of trying to regulate someone to not subdivide, you talk to them, you negotiate, you build a relationship, you find out that they care too about their land, many of them. We're talking about mostly conservative people. And you say, how can we financially compensate you to never subdivide, to keep it a ranch, to keep going as is, because it's pretty good. The wildlife are really doing well if that's the landscape we keep together. It perpetually removes subdivision rights from a piece of property. Right? You think that you have mineral rights, you sell them, you can't mine, you get sued. You have water rights, you sell them, you can't use the water, you get sued. If you donate or sell your subdivision rights, you darn well can't develop that property, you get sued. So these easement agreements are more or less to keep things as they are, functional, beautiful, intact. Stewardship and money both motivate people. So now let's look at this map in a different light. Everything in white before, everything in purple now, conservation easements. You go, well, that's not that dramatic, is it? You go before and after, but look a little closer. In the greater Yellowstone, the Blackfoot, the Rocky Mountain Front, northwest Montana. We'll dive in at a different scale. So here's the punchline of the book. 6 million acres of private land have been conserved in the last 50 years in Montana. Mostly conservation easements and some land purchases. That's 10% of the national total for this land trust kind of idea in a state with 1/3 of 1% the population of the country. Yay, Montana, right? I'm floored by this, and I've been working in it all these years, and it still blows me away how much has happened here. So where are they protected and why? Well, there's no hero of the tale. It's all about relationships. You can see all the players, landowners, ranchers. They are the ones who have the decision to make. But these nonprofit groups called land trusts, like the Montana Land Reliance, which has almost 1.5 million acres under conservation easement. That's stunning. Prickly Pear Land Trust, Five Valleys, and so forth. The tribes, national NGOs, and government agencies. And into this tale, everybody plays a role. It could be negotiation, it could be managing adjacent land, it could be finding the money to buy conservation easements. Thank you for that. So let's, in the book, which I hope you get a copy of, we look at these regions. Tonight we're going to focus a little bit more locally than statewide, and my friend and colleague, the legendary Top Rabbit, Bob Kiesling, is going to talk to you about the Blackfoot watershed. There you go. Never see the clicker.
Thanks, Jack. Just a word about origins here. Over 5 years ago, the three of us were sitting around drinking too many suds, and we got a little carried away with our reminiscing about all the conservation work that had been done. And at that time, we surprised ourselves just thinking about how much activity there had been. So after too many suds, we decided somebody ought to write about this. It's a good story. Why not us? Because we had fingerprints on a lot of these projects around the state. And that's exactly what we decided to do. Subsequent to that, COVID hit. And so we just think of this as our 5-year COVID project. In any case, that's an origin story. To do this, though, we had to have a framework for the book. So we decided to begin with Earth Day 1970. That was the very first Earth Day in April. And then looking forward for the next half century, what could be said about the state of conservation? Well, if you turn the clock back to 1970, there wasn't anything conserved in Montana. None. No, none of those 6 million acres were on the radar at that point. So to make 6 million acres of conservation progress in a 50-year time span was a good stroke indeed. You cannot tell the story of conservation that at least is for which conservation easements are the very backbone of this tale, without also talking about another origin story, and that is to talk about the Blackfoot Valley, and indeed the whole Blackfoot watershed. The reason for that, I think, can be blamed on a bunch of you people, you Missoulians, university students and so on, began using the Blackfoot River as a recreation paradise, and the amount of traffic that it began to take, apart from all those drunk students running the river in inner tubes, the quality of boats and rafts and so on began to upgrade. And the next thing you know, the Blackfoot is a high traffic waterway. Guess what happens? The public, you always get the lowest denominator problems when there's that much public use. So people were camping illegally on private lands, and they'd leave trash. It suffered a lot of abuse. Not only that, but the Blackfoot was widely renowned for being such a beautiful river that in the late 60s and 70s, the federal government considered putting it into, designated as part of the National Wild and Scenic River System, also a relatively new piece of legislation. When the ranchers in the Blackfoot Valley pondered that, they said, "Ew, I don't think we want the heavy hand of the federal government here. We don't know what those agencies are going to mean to us in terms of our stewardship and land management. We'd like to figure out another alternative." So people started jawboning about what options there were. In those days, in the early 70s, again, part of the problem was that there was no conservation easement statute that had been passed by the legislature enabling this tool to be used. The only way you could take a conservation easement on private land was if an agency or an NGO owned a piece that adjoined the property that you wanted an easement on. So very awkwardly, we set about taking a few easements here and there, but it was very clumsy. Enough popularity developed, though, for the legislature to deal with this problem. And in 1975, it finally passed the Montana Voluntary Open Space and Conservation Easement Act. That was like ringing in a starting bell, because following that Act's passage, people got busy and and started going after conservation easements with a vengeance. And particularly in the Blackfoot, now there was a tool. Now this use of conservation easements was sanctioned in state law, and we could get creative about figuring out how to draw some dollars into the easements, purchasing some from ranchers that were otherwise probably unwilling to do it. Other ranchers donated easements, and all of this was not free. As I said, there was capital involved, but there was also a trade-off. In other words, the ranchers said, if we don't want the federal government in here telling us what we can and can't do with our private lands in the river corridor here, then we better create our own solution. Part of that solution was collaborating with the federal and state agencies, particularly Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, okay, we'll protect our private lands. They said, if we could get cooperation from the federal agencies and state agencies to manage crowd control on the river. So it was a good arrangement. Now the landowners had a mechanism whereby they could get help from the state and the feds, keeping the river corridor clean, allocating campsites and access points along the river. So it's a story of organic growth, really. I mean, what happened in the Blackfoot, we're here in 1970. This is what it looked like in 1970. You see the big blocks of public land here, and over here we've got this Lubrecht experimental forest managed by the University of Montana and company. So there was very little that existed at that time in the way of formal protection. But was it deserving of protection? Absolutely. One big shot in the arm came from this book, A River Runs Through It, immensely popular because Norman Maclean lived many days and hours on the Blackfoot River fishing. I was down in Los Angeles one time at a meeting, and a movie producer came up to me and said, hey, we've got the rights to film, to create a movie of A River Runs Through It. It took a long time to get permission from Norman Maclean for that to happen, but they got it. So they were asking me, where should we film? I said, what are you talking about? The Blackfoot is the only place you should be filming. But when they came up to scout, guess what? A lot of the mountains ringing the valley and the river corridor were whacked. Champion and other timber beasts had clear-cut a lot of the backdrop for the Blackfoot. So the movie people went down to the Yellowstone and to the Gallatin rivers to actually crank out the movie. So here we go. Norman, thank you. Lasting contribution. Is there a better opening line for a book than that? I don't know. And Blackfoot's landscapes, in addition to the river, are just eye candy for most of us. We've come to appreciate them so much. It's loaded with wildlife. Here's a junction of the North Fork coming into the Blackfoot here. These two guys, Hank Getz on the left and Len Lindbergh on the right, one of the things that we learned in the course of stitching easements together on the Blackfoot was it really works best if you've got a community leader or two who are enthused about this and whose stature is such that they're going to positively influence their neighbors to do the same thing. We can thank these two guys for that role that they played. And the ranchers, of course. So, this is where the three of us really began to see what was happening out there because we worked with Hannah and her boss to produce these maps. And we said, well, our start date is Earth Day 1970. This is what the Blackfoot watershed looked like then. Now, fast forward 50 years, all the purple is conserved now. When you think about this in watershed terms, about 85% of this watershed is now permanently protected. That's a staggering feat in. And so the Blackfoot, we came to think of it as the point of origin for easements and spreading in Montana, right here in Missoula's backyard. So all you people who are still out there using the river can now thank the accomplishments of these ranchers for doing the right thing with their land.
Well, hopefully this is a familiar sight to many of you. It's the open ranch land is the Line Ranch in the South Hills of Missoula. And in the far background, let's see, I get to do this, don't I? This is the Rattlesnake watershed here. And the city, the university, and Sentinel, Jumbo, North Hills. An incredible landscape that we live in. And if you, when you leave tonight and look around on the horizon, most of what you see is now conserved. That's happened over 40, 50 years. One of the first places that sort of led the charge was the Rattlesnake watershed. At the time, back in the 70s, the watershed was sort of a place for occasional beer bus and motorbikes was another big one that back then. And there was a group that formed called the Friends of the Rattlesnake. And Kaschinsky was the lead of that. Jack mentioned Joe Musselman, who was a professor in music. He just loved that watershed and hiked there for years. And he organized a board of directors. I got invited in at that point, just coming out of the university looking for my future and trying to wonder what the heck I was going to do. But the watershed itself is some 90,000 acres. About half of that was the Montana Power Company. And the way that the ownership goes there, let's see if we got it here. Well, this is, of course, I gave away the story here now. The watershed, the Rattlesnake watershed looked like a chessboard. The railroad land grants that extended away from the railroad that came through over 100 years before then earned the railroad company alternating sections of land, 640 acres in a section, and creates this pattern. This is not unique to the Rattlesnake. This pattern is very common all through western Montana and on down into south central Montana. So the question was, there's concern about having all of this clear cut, logged extensively, and then developed. In the 70s, for those that may remember, that was the time we had our early subdivision boom. And particularly going up along the Rattlesnake Creek, just one after another, houses being put up there. And the looking up in the upper Rattlesnake, there is over 12 miles of that stream that could be developed. To say nothing of 25, 30 lakes in the upper mountains of the watershed. So the time was for discussion, going and visiting with Montana Power Company often, trying to find out what would motivate them to work with the Friends of the Rattlesnake in the city. And in 1980, that coalesced into the federal government designated the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area and Wilderness. Well, half of that happened to be Montana Power Company still. So the legislation, and I need to mention Pat Williams. I'm sorry that he's not here to just thank him 20 times. He was a strong champion of the designation for the area. He was very interested in the educational potential near the university, and he was joined by Max Baucus and Lee Metcalf. So the legislation got passed, but in that legislation was Montana Power said, okay, we'll do this if you compensate us at the full fair market value of this property. So they went to work looking for the money, not there. So let's look for some land to trade for this land. They went looking in many places. I had been involved then in some land trades over in the Missouri, in the Gates of the Mountains for a couple of years. And I got a call one day from the Montana Power Company, said, hey, do you have any ideas how we could do this? Well, we looked at, again, more properties, and they focused in particular on coal properties in Texas and other places. And none of that suited them. So at the last minute, because there was a time clock running on this, we came up with an idea, and that was to trade the lands in the Rattlesnake for coal. And you have to sort of, I don't know if we can do that. But Montana Power Company had a subsidiary, Western Energy, that owned coal leases on federal land and federal coal. And the energy company had already successfully leased those lands. The lands had gone through environmental impact statements, a permitting process, and so on. And we figured out that they could trade. They paid every quarter. They paid severance taxes and continued the mineral leasing. And we figured out that in a few years they could trade out by writing themselves a check for half of each quarter's transaction until they had achieved their full value, which they did. So it's an odd thing to trade wilderness for coal, but it's not quite the same level of concern it is now, but that coal was already being mined. So it was a way of putting that to the use of the rattlesnake. So, Erica, okay. This is what it looks like now. About 90% of the watershed is conserved. Some of you may remember that the water company that owned the water rights that Montana Power had sold also required a dam in the down here in the lower end of this property, and a pipeline extending onto Waterworks Hill where it pressurized water and supplied to the city. Well, along came Giardia, and nobody wanted to drink the rattlesnake water with Giardia in it. It's not a pleasant thing. The city developed deep water wells. That's now our source of water for Missoula, for the public water. And the dam that diverted that water was taken out 3 years ago, I think it was. And one of the names the Salish and Kootenai had for Missoula was a birthplace of bull trout. And so for the first time in almost 100 years, the bull trout are now running all the way up the Rattlesnake. So along with cutthroat and a few others up there. So that in turn, that effort spun off conservation easements and land acquisitions on the hillsides on Jumbo and on waterworks and along the stream. And almost happened, right now it's almost connected public land all the way up from Reno Park. So the point here is that with this larger effort, there were many things that happened because of it. The people that had learned to work together and learn how to make these systems work were successful through the successful through the city council, bond issues that raised the money for purchases. And so again, going out the door, you see Jumbo, Sentinel, South Hills, and on around to the federal lands on the west side. Coming in, another good one that I don't think I've got a lot of time to talk about, but the Alberton Gorge was another one that came out of that. That was at where Fish Creek comes in. For those of you who have floated the gorge, they often, the float trips stop there. And so you can walk up Fish Creek a little ways. And it's a beautiful stream coming in there. That was a dam site. And we worked out a deal for Montana Power again, where they were compensated for their easements and land that they owned along the Alberton Gorge. So now we get to enjoy that. But I must say a large part of that project happened led by Five Valley Land Trust. There's another book that you should look at that the Five Valleys has produced that, if I could think of a Gracious Civic Enterprise. It's very well done, and it was done in-house, 2 of the employees, and very good writers. And it's a great book to read. So, other places here. This is looking at the Rattlesnake, the trails going up there. I must say again, 50 years ago, those fields were solid knapweed and leafy spurge. There were a lot of trees that were coming back slowly, but this lovely mosaic of the larch that you see there, the changing colors. We've got some family responsibilities here that had to be dealt with here. So forewarned, but the Rattlesnake Creek, here's the horse crossing. So many of you have probably approached both ways. 50 years ago, there was enough room to park 6 cars in the parking lot. There are a few more than that that use that area and beyond. The 9 Mile Valley is another area. The 9 Mile became known for the first wolf out of Glacier Park that was tracked leaving the park and came down and established new territory in the upper 9 Mile, the Thisted Ranch. And fortunately, the Thisted brothers just loved watching the wolves, and as long as the wolves didn't eat cows, they were fine with it, and that worked out pretty well over time. So there's another book about that. Rick Bass has written about that. And there is one. So now shifting to the mission.
This is like our nickname is Los Tres Guapos. It means the 3 handsome guys. So we're kind of fond of ourselves, so forgive that. I'm going to take, thank you, Bruce. I'm going to take a moment. Pat Williams passed away, and some of you went to his service. He was so influential. He had the house up the Rattlesnake. He dearly loved this watershed. And he's a real loss, of course. And in the story of the Blackfoot, of course, Bob Redford died, and he was the director of that great film. And Onyx Smith and Bill Kittredge got the screen rights, and they helped make this movie come forward. And I saw Anik the other day, and she said, we called him Ordinary Bob. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, he didn't like being a handsome movie star. He wanted to be seen as a working actor who had a good craft, who made good movies. He died at 89. And so I think that's a piece of this story, isn't it? Inevitably, you think about stewardship and leaving the scene. What's the world going to be like when we move on? I don't mean a downer about it, but there's something very clarifying about that. All right. And before we move on too far, I want to also thank, and I'm going to embarrass him, but I worked with Bruce Bugbee for many years. I was assistant, a couple of mapping things and so forth, but Bruce Bugbee bore the weight of that transaction for years with Montana Power, and I think he deserves a round of applause for getting that deal done. He's a modest man, but I think it was worth recognizing him. Okay. We were also blessed in this project to go up into the Flathead Reservation, this beautiful part of the world. Of course, they're known for bison up there. And the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, we talked to them about, say, can you tell us your story? And we wrote down a few things. It's not quite right. Well, we know. Can you write it? And finally, enough trust was built up through Tom McDonald, Tony Incashola Jr., Jermaine White, and so many other people. They said, all right, we're in. We'll write a chapter, and we'll make our own map. And Hannah knows that the map that they produced is very different than ours. This was the complexity that they see. And just a few highlights. The only tribal wilderness area in the United States is the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness. Isn't that something? They have a big buffer zone around it for grizz, a grizz management area. What was the National Bison Range, an area stolen from the CSKT, a few years ago, a deal was arranged. They now are managing it. It's under federal ownership technically, but it's the tribes again. And that's wonderful because when this was formed, it was a bunch of wealthy New York people who said, we like bison. All right, government, go rip off a reservation and we'll bring a herd in. Well, the story precedes that because the CSKT, when the bison were being slaughtered on the plains, they went out there and once the young ones, the mothers were dry, they got the young ones and drove them onto the res and built up a herd. And then the Easterners got the idea, well, let's make a bison range. It's now theirs, and it should be. They've also got an equivalent of a wild and scenic river on the Flathead, which has teeth. There will be no development along that river. They also have tribal primitive areas, meaning unless you're a tribal member, you can't go there. They have elk and bighorn sheep management areas. There's easements. There's a piece up here near Wild Horse Island. There is also the Animals Bridge, which you know, and a whole string along Highway 93 of culverts and underpasses, fencing, to try to reduce the number of animals killed. And it's working. And so the bison are the main tail, as you'd expect. But look at that. Kevin League used a drone to go up and get to film, take a shot of this incredible feature. And these now exist all over the country, and in fact, all over the world. We're trying to find that balance point and respect wildlife species. Keys to the Rocky Mountain front for a minute.
Thank you. It's hard to find more spectacular scenery in Montana than exists along the Rocky Mountain front. So, for those of you unfamiliar with the area, there's a Blackfeet Indian reservation that borders Canada. It's about 1 million acres up there at the northern end of this complex. And you got Glacier Park to its left, it's got this long boundary with the national park. And then the national forest lands in here, the Bob Marshall, the Scapegoat Wilderness. But these big blocks of public land are incompletely adequate for wildlife if the wildlife move out of the high areas and come down onto the foothills during winter months. This is a particularly rich area for the ungulates because Chinook winds sweep in and melt the snow that's fallen, so they have access to good grazing during the winter months. Critical for their survival and success. Well, in the 1970s, sorry, people, for my technological incompetence here. Anyway, in the 1970s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service felt that they were going to get a chunk of money from the federal government for the protection of important wildlife ecosystems. They shotgunned out a letter to all the Audubon chapters and the Wildlife Federation people and anybody that was interested in wildlife, seeking nominations for what areas would be worthy of federal protection. One of the top of the list places was this area along the Rocky Mountain frontier where there was a big swamp right in here. Pine Butte Swamp, it was known as, is to this day known as. And lo and behold, grizzly bears would come out of hibernation, work their way down slope through the foothills, following the creek corridors, and get down into this lowland area where the grass was green. They're mostly vegetarians at that time of year, plus eating carrion from winter-killed elk. But that area became a top target for conservation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, anticipating that they would get federal money to protect that area, asked the Nature Conservancy. I was with the Nature Conservancy at that time. They said, can you guys step in and start acquiring land there ahead of us federal people? And then when we get the appropriations from Congress, we'll pay you back. We'll buy you out. That never happened because Jimmy Carter lost the presidency to Ronald Reagan. And with that event, you could hear the coffer lids slamming shut back in D.C. There wasn't going to be any more money spent on acquiring public land under that administration. Remember the famous James Watt? The entire administration was antithetical to spending money, federal money, on land conservation. So it just didn't happen. The Nature Conservancy by then had come to really appreciate the wildlife characteristics of the Pine Butte Swamp. And so it said, well, let's just keep it and turn it into a nature sanctuary of our devising. Sooner or later, though, it became pretty clear, you can save what amount to postage stamp areas in size along a spectacular mountain flank like this, and it still doesn't get the job done. So we knew that for just the grizzly bear alone, you had to move up and down that Rocky Mountain front and conserve ranch lands that bordered the public lands. And there began a concerted effort to acquire conservation easements in this neighborhood. Now you see the difference. That's what it looked like in 1970. Essentially no protection in that white strip on the right side of the graphic there. Fast forward to the present, look what's been done. Again, this level of conservation has required a lot of capital. Ranchers typically want to be compensated if they're going to put their lands under permanent protection. And that's worked out pretty well. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has purchased easements on a lot of the purple lands that you see there. The Nature Conservancy has acquired more easements through gift and occasional purchases. Other conservation organizations have gotten involved. And so, long story short, the Rocky Mountain front remains this spectacular chunk of Montana. It always rings my chimes because when you drive up along the front there on the highways, there are very few transmission lines. The skyscapes, the landscapes are drop dead gorgeous. And now we can do so with the confidence of knowing it's going to be like that forever. This is, by the way, it's Freeze Out Lake, one of the water bodies along the front that is an immense contribution to wildlife migrations. Birds, thousands and millions of snow geese go through here all the time.
I'm glad Bob got that round of applause, because at the time the Nature Conservancy was thinking, well, let's get this 5-acre piece for that rare plant. We don't need whole landscapes. But Bob here stuck his neck out and changed things in a large way nationally for that organization. They started thinking big, and Bob did a lot of that work. Well, to wrap up, the Greater Yellowstone is also one of the landscapes that we have a chapter on, the Paradise, Gallatin, Madison, and Centennial Valleys. And as I mentioned, even 2.2 million acre park is not big enough for these critters. They need to be able to migrate, especially as climates change. They need to be able to go north, south, up in elevation to north aspects, find water. They need a lot of opportunity. And through the conservation actions we've talked about tonight, they have that fighting chance. And that's a beautiful thing. This is, of course, typical of the landscape, the park or wilderness up high, and those precious ranches under conservation easements down below. This is where the species need to be in the winter and other seasons. There's nothing quite like that. The Rocky Mountain front and Yellowstone are as biologically vital as is possible to imagine. There's black-footed ferrets now in Montana. All these species are here. Now, these migrations aren't without controversy, but we can work those things out as reasonable people. And this is just one example of a valley, the Madison Valley. Once again, look at all that purple, that royal purple. So when next time you drive any one of those valleys, there's this idea that's floating around called 30 by 30, you may have heard of. Conserve 30% of the earth by 2030. That's in the rearview mirror in Montana. That's been true for decades. And lest you doubt the strength of these easement tools, recall what it is. It's not a regulation. It's not a passing fancy. This is private property rights. The sacred earth is also real estate. Money has changed hands. These landowners tend to be conservative people, and anyone goes after private property rights, what caliber of response do you think there'd be from rural Montanans? So this is stout. This isn't going anywhere. So we think about the future. I think all of us, by doing this project, feel much more optimistic and hopeful in a time we need it. Jane Goodall, my personal hero, I even named my pickup after her. That's Jane, my truck outside. She wrote a book called The Book of Hope. And in it she talks about we can all be ambassadors for hope by doing tangible actions and reaching across these seeming differences. And the Blackfoot Challenge has this saying, the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the barbed wire is nice and smooth. It doesn't hurt us. It's only that 20% that'll stick you. Let's focus on the 80% that we can often agree on. That's the lesson of this book. As we contemplate our place on this earth, be of good cheer. This work exists. There's ways to help. And what can you do? Of course, we're here to share the news and the story, but I think we're not mentioned in the book, even though we were amply involved. Hundreds of names. You're going to recognize a lot of them. And I think that's the good news that we're sharing here tonight. So we really appreciate you being here, and we'd love to take any questions you have.
while you're formulating your questions, a last observation. If you think back to the before and after, what did Montana landscapes look like back in 1970? Nothing was preserved or conserved. Now, fast forward 6 million acres later, it's quite a track record. As Jack pointed out, Montana has the most conservation easement protected lands in the country, with the exception of maybe California, I'm not sure. But yeah, we've got 10% of the nation's total. That's pretty damn good for a tiny state like ours in population. One thing I'd like to say about all of that, though, is that all of this 6 million acres worth of conservation did not happen through any master plan. Nobody in the legislature, nobody in the federal government said, gee, Montana's got a magnificent set of landscapes. Let's go out there and figure out how to methodically protect the best of the best. That didn't happen. Nobody had a blueprint for this. This just all came about organically. And largely because of the goodwill and the loving care of landowners who have decided that it's better the way it is than if it were fragmented and chopped up.
Just a quick addition to that, the Five Valleys Land Trust was formed in 1972, I think. Hopefully I got that right. And they now manage over 120,000 acres of conservation easement. The Montana Land Reliance, which was active in the early years in the Blackfoot, is now at 1.2 million, 1.4 million acres. I mean, a lot of work done by the land trusts in getting to know the landowners, working with them personally, finding out where they can be most helpful in finding the best solution for the land and the landowners. So that's worked out very well. Can I add one more thing, please? One of my favorite things to comment on is these photographs by Kevin League. It was important to us that we have a consistent quality all through the book. And I've often thought that we could have made a chapter just out of photographs. But I think you'll find as you go through it that the photographs are located just so that as you read the text, all of a sudden there's the picture of what you've been reading about, and a beautiful, beautiful set of pictures. But that's how we get to know a place. It's what we see. And that seeing that over and over again develops a relationship. And it is through that relationship and in its broader context how we are sustained. And with that sustenance comes an obligation that we give back.
Where does American Prairie Reserve fit into this picture?
We found a number of sort of initial impetus for conservation in different parts of the state. The American Prairie is on the lower portion of the Missouri River in Montana. It's ranch country, and in the, was it the 70s? Oh, no, 80s. 80s, the World Wildlife Fund did a map of the world looking for the major ecosystems and their status. And they found that the shortgrass prairie that is in eastern Montana was one of, I think, 3 or 4 areas in the world that are still as a native landscape. And that kicked the whole process into gear. What they did differently is they brought together a group of people that, philanthropists, and asked them to step up and acquire the property needed to complete the picture of conservation, and adding bison along the way as a major part of that, as it was originally. And they have now gone for 25 years. I think the organization itself has been in existence for 25 years. They have acquired many ranches and with them the grazing rights on adjacent public lands. One other note there is that the most of the public lands outside of the C.M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, that long reservoir there, 100 miles or so, the majority of the federal lands in that area is Bureau of Land Management. And it's Bureau of Land Management because they were lands that the ranchers who homesteaded the area couldn't make a nickel on. And I encourage you to go out and see it. It's an incredible landscape. It just tend to be very careful to avoid the rain, because when it rains, the soil is filled with clay, and you will find yourselves immediately in a quagmire, dragging along half an acre with each step. But that the wildlife, the native wildlife, figured that out a long time ago and have done well in that landscape. The whole area there, the C.M. Russell is 1.5 million acres by itself, and they're trying to assemble a combined private and public area of 3.2 million acres. They're about halfway there, and they have about, I think it's about 1,000 bison out there now. And they have a series of yurts near the Missouri that you can hike from one to the next. You can reserve them, and it's a fabulous way to see the area. But that country has its own mystique and beauty every bit as much as the Rocky Mountain front. The vastness of those prairie landscapes is incredible, and but their approach as active purchasers has put them into the role of perceived competition with the local ranchers, and it has been a somewhat contentious history, and they've worked with it, and they are trying to put their best foot forward always in honest dealings and respecting those folks that are there. So they're able to keep going, and it's an amazing project that they put together.
After the legislature last spring, I heard some comments about wanting to legislate limiting the length of time of these protections. What can you say to that?
What we can say to that is that it wasn't just the last legislative session. It's every legislative session. There are a bunch of cantankerous people who would just as soon not see any of this conservation happen. And they come in and they say it's not right that these things exist, these protective easements exist in perpetuity. We think there should be a lid on the time that they exist, because you don't want to be tying the hands of future landowners. That's just not right. This is private property, and you need to preserve some of those rights for future decision makers there. To which we always gang up on them and say, guess what? You are the advocates of private property. What's going on with these easements is private landowners are making a decision to conserve their lands now. And what's wrong with that? So you catch them in a bit of hypocrisy here. There was a little old lady on the Blackfoot, one of the earliest easements we did there. She was a retired school teacher from Chinook, Montana, living on a fixed income, a meager Social Security check and teacher's retirement. She wanted to put a really restrictive easement on her 500 acres. And so I was doing the Nature Conservancy at the time. We complied. We wrote an easement that was really strict. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't harvest timber. You couldn't trap anything. She was that much a wildlife nut. You had to go before the planning board. That's one of the rules for conservation easement taking. You have to go before local government and present the easement, the protection that's going to occur there, and seek their opinions about it. We weren't stupid enough to give local government veto power over these easements. If that had happened, we wouldn't have half the progress that we've seen. So anyway, we took this easement in front of the Powell County Planning Board, and the planning board was filled with board members who scratched their heads and said, this is not right. There's no way that this woman should make a decision that's permanent in conserving these lands for the same reasons I mentioned. They didn't think it was right to tie the hands of future generations by making a permanent decision. I asked them, I said, how many subdivisions have you turned down? 0. They've approved every time a landowner comes in and wants to create a bunch of 20-acre tracts or 5-acre cabin sites or whatever. Yeah, it's private property. You can do what you want with it. I said, well, why does it work for private property owners who want to develop, but not somebody who doesn't want to develop? It's still hard to get people to think past their own hypocrisy on this issue, but back to your full circle question here. Every legislative session, people come up there and gun after the conservation easement statute. They gun for it. They're trying to kill it, eliminate it, put terms on it, just squish it out of existence. And mostly the reason that it doesn't get anywhere is because guess who comes up to the legislature and says, no way, Jose? Ranchers, farmers, people who have donated or sold conservation easements. They are the best advocates because now you're talking citizen to citizen in the legislative context. And that seems to be what the winning formula is. It's terrible to be that defensive all the time in the Montana legislature, but it's just the nature of it, yeah.
One quick addition to that is that the most active in terms of total acres in Wyoming Land Trust is the Wyoming cattle growers. They think this is great stuff, and they've done a lot of good work. Colorado, a similar case.
Plains, all the cattle growers associations love this option.
Yes.
To conserve your land.
Yep.
It's private property rights. Don't overthink.
Yep. And New Mexico, where Jack spends half of the year. He happens also to be the chair of their land trust for New Mexico. The let's end this here.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for all the things that you guys have done to keep the lands that we have in the places that we enjoy, all enjoy. One question I had was, how optimistic are you about the future? I hate to say that, but you guys have seen everything along the way for almost 50 years now, and so you know where it's going.
I didn't know this was going to be a counseling session, but no. Yeah, I know. It depends on the day for all of us, doesn't it? You know, what the news is and what's going on with their families. And again, this is about legacy. We do the best we can right now, and let the chips fall when we're gone. That's about all I know. I know this work matters. Keys.
Yeah. Remember the story I was telling about how there was federal money being appropriated by Congress every congressional session for use in acquiring parks, pools, baseball diamonds, and open space lands all around the country through what is known as the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That fund essentially dried up after Jimmy Carter left office and Ronald Reagan administration got in. No more money will be spent on acquiring public land. I was about to fold up our tent because I thought, well, there goes a big chunk of the resources that we need to get some of this protection work done. But guess what? During the Reagan administration, because of their attitudes about public land ownership and so on, there arose an organization called the Sagebrush Rebellion. And all these conservative cattle ranchers that were using and abusing public lands for grazing, they didn't like the idea of the federal government owning anything. So there was a big push. They thought, under Reagan, we can probably eliminate a bunch of this agency ownership of precious spaces that we think should be better off in private ownership. Well, guess what? This too shall pass. Reagan's out. Clinton gets in there, and then boom, things got kind of back to normal. When I say normal, I just mean more congressional funding for land conservation came to pass. Now I know why you asked that question about, is it an optimistic future we're looking at or not? I'd have to say in this moment, yeah, it's a very dim time in our country's history. But I have a feeling that this too shall pass and will. The good work that you see being done voluntarily here is the source of that optimism and hope. There's going to be a lot more people getting enthused about this.
Have you got younger people involved in this?
Oh yeah, all the land trust groups, all the organizations have a lot of young people that are working all this. I'm sorry about that microphone.
Yes, this is not going anywhere. When we started doing this work more than 50 years ago, there were a handful of these land trust groups in the country. Now there's 1,800, and we're to 60 million acres. And it's important to note on another matter, you may have heard that Senator Mike Lee proposed a massive sell-off of federal lands. And he got spanked pretty hard because all the delegations from the western states said, hell no. Conservative they may be, doesn't matter. They read the situation correctly. We're not disposing of these lands. Montanans and Wyoming people not going to have it. Now you can manage it, you can trade and everything, but don't look at that as a bank. That's one of the main assets that average Montanans have. That's their wealth. They get to go to these public lands and recreate.
For young people, the Montana Constitution, pay attention to the preamble of the Constitution. And a couple of years ago, there was a group of, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but I think 12 young people from 2 or 4 years to 15 that decided to take on the state of Montana for making it too easy on oil and gas development. These are kids. They won. They won their lawsuit. They just last week, they brought the lawsuit, a similar lawsuit, to the federal government. And yeah, and it's, I find a lot of hope in that going forward. And incidentally, the person authoring that was Mainan Ellingson from Missoula. She and Bob Campbell. And
yeah, in the 1972 Montana Constitution, they rewrote it in Mainan. They have a provision, guarantee of a clean and healthful environment. That's pretty unusual. Thank you, Mainan. Oh boy, snacks. Rather fond of snacks. Anyone else? If not, thank you all so much for making time. Appreciate you. Go Montana.